Hello everyone. This week we reach a major milestone in the public court Waka tradition with the compilation and circulation of the first Imperial Anthology of Waka, Kokinshū. It is, I think, impossible to overstate the influence of this work, because virtually everything that came after it either emulated it or, more rarely, reacted against it. Thus, it's probably not going too far to say that if you understand Kokinshu, then you understand the basis for all subsequent Waka. Even today, it continues to be an object of analysis and study and a model of content and practice against which poetics and poetry in later ages are measured. You're probably getting used to hearing me say this, but this means that all I'm going to be able to do in this brief presentation is scratch the surface of this work, and I strongly recommend delving into the voluminous scholarly literature on the anthology in order to get a clearer and more in-depth picture of its content and significance. What I'm going to try to do here, then, is point out a few of the anthology's most important features and influences, while also giving you a sense of what made it so important for the poets who came after it. I hope that after you've heard what I have to say, you will become encouraged to read more about Kokinshu in order to understand it better, and also, of course, read the anthology itself for pleasure as well as study. So, with that end in mind, let's get started. I'm going to start with a few basic facts and figures about the anthology. First of all, there's the work's title. Its full formal title is Kokin Wakashu, or the collection of Japanese poetry, ancient and modern. Just as an aside, this translation of the title is somewhat imprecise, given that there was no such thing as a nation-state called Japan at the time Kokinshu was put together. Thus, it might be more accurate to translate the title as the collection of Yamato poetry, ancient and modern, but for simplicity's sake I will continue to use the term Japan here, as I have in other videos. The title itself is an explicit public statement of the underlying purpose behind the work's compilation. It is a collection of waka, and does not contain any verse written in Chinese. Again, note that I'm using the word Chinese here as a convenient shorthand. China as a state, of course, would not exist for centuries, and so the language at this time might be more accurately described as literary Sinitic, but due to the relative obscurity of this term, I will continue to use Chinese here. It might seem obvious that a collection of poetry by Japanese poets compiled in Japan should only contain Japanese poetry, but this is not the case given the cultural and linguistic complexities of the early Heian period. In writing at least, Heian Japan was a multilingual society, where educated people learned to read and write both Japanese, their native language, and also classical Chinese, the vehicle through which one could access continental learning. That learning encompassed areas such as philosophy, medicine, history, religion, and, of course, literature. Although in this context, literature largely meant poetry. Naturally then, when people wrote about topics such as these, they largely wrote in classical Chinese. Writing in Japanese was used for private communication and the writing of vernacular literature, principally poetry, but also tales, some essays and some diaries. The extent to which people of the time were aware of classical Chinese and Japanese as different languages, as opposed to simply different modes of writing, is a matter of continuing debate among scholars and linguists. Certainly, in some prose texts written a couple of hundred years later, we can see people freely mixing phrases in Japanese and Chinese, often in the same sentence, which demonstrates that they, at least, did not really think of them as separate languages, and simply used what felt like the most appropriate form of words or form of language to use in that particular context. Note that I'm using the word people here deliberately. There has been a tendency to view Chinese literacy as largely a male preserve, and there's no doubt that this is broadly true, but there is a certain amount of evidence to suggest that it was more widespread among women than has previously been thought. And it was simply that being known to be literate in Chinese was seen as unfeminine, so women had a vested interest in concealing their knowledge if they had it. Returning to the beginning of the 10th century, however, this was a period when Waka poetry had largely been eclipsed as a vehicle for public expression by poetry written in Chinese. So, by defining from the outset that Kokinshu was an anthology of Japanese poetry, Waka, the compilers were making an explicit statement that poetry in this form could be considered a genre in its own right, which had equivalent prestige to poetry written in Chinese. This means that quite apart from its literary content, Kokinshu is a deeply political work, marking a new ascendancy, or a new claim to ascendancy, of vernacular culture over that from the continent. That's not to say, however, that the poetry in Kokinshu is free from continental influence, as we shall see later. Just as important as the Waka element of the title, however, is the statement that the anthology contains both ancient and modern poetry. Essentially, the Waka included in the anthology covers three main periods: the early to mid 9th century or earlier, the mid to late 9th century, and the early 10th century. Work from each of these periods is included for different reasons. The first period, the truly ancient poetry, allows Kokinshu to link with Manyorshu and demonstrate the ultimate continuity of the Waka tradition. The second period is that when the six poetic sages, exemplary poets of the past, were active, and the third period is when the compilers and their contemporaries were writing, the modern present. This periodization was an attempt to demonstrate that the Waka poetry of the 10th century was the heir to a centuries-old tradition, with its own history and cultural significance, which was a further claim to its status as a genre which was of equivalent importance to poetry in Chinese. While the idea of an imperial anthology of Waka poetry was first mooted by Emperor Uda, it was his son and successor, Emperor Daigo, who actually gave the order for its compilation. He gave the commission to a team of 4 poets who were active in court circles at the time: Kino Tsurayuki, Kino Tomonori, Oshikochi no Mitsune, and Mibu no Tadamine. Given that Tomonori died soon after the commission was awarded, it seems that he only had a minimal influence on its editorial policy, and the work's overall critical vision is generally attributed to Tsurayuki, as he was the author of one of its 2 prefaces, while the other was written by a distant relative of his who also happened to be his son-in-law. The exact year in which the commission was given is unclear, but this is usually dated to 905. Equally, the year in which the anthology was completed remains uncertain. It appears that it was probably largely complete by 915, but that the text continued to be revised over the subsequent several years, as a poem which could be dated to 920 is included within it. Modern standard versions of the anthology contain 1100 poems in the main text, and a further 11 poems which are listed as having been included in variant texts. The vast majority of its contents are 57577 syllable Waka, but there are 9 poems in variant forms as well, which indicates that the former type of poem had not yet achieved total dominance. Like the earlier Manyorshu, Kokinshu was organised into 20 books. Unlike Manyorshu, however, each book is dedicated to poems on a single formal topic, demonstrating that by this time, topic, dai, was already an important means of classifying and defining individual poems. As you can see on the slide here, the anthology is broadly divided into 2 halves, with the initial part of each half being devoted to the 2 most important topics, the seasons and love. The remaining parts of each half are made up of books devoted to lesser topics. This placing was deliberate and intended to create a sense of balance in the work as a whole, and provides further evidence, if any were needed, that the compilers did have an awareness of the anthology as a complete work, and not just as a collection of individual poems unrelated to each other. There are 15 poets, whose names I have listed here, who have more than 5 poems included in the anthology, and can thus be considered its most significant contributors. As you can see, however, Tsurayuki dominates, with his poetry accounting for almost 1/10 of the anthology's contents. The remaining 3 compilers are also well represented, also accounting for over 1/10 of Kokinshu's contents between them. While there's no doubt that all 4 of these men were excellent poets, it's hard not to feel that the inclusion of so much of their work is by virtue of their position in putting the collection together. Of the remaining major poets, Henjo, Narihira and Komachi are three of the poetic sages referred to by Tsurayuki in his preface, and are great poets of the past whose work, while not without fault, is nevertheless an example of the best of the Waka tradition. Of the three, Narihira and Komachi are the best known today, as are Tsurayuki's criticisms of their work. Of Komachi, who is undoubtedly one of the two most passionate female poets in Waka history, he remarks, "Her poetry is full of feeling but lacking in vigour, like a noble lady suffering from discomfort. But then weakness is a key element of women's poetry." This view of women's poetry as lacking in strength was widely accepted by subsequent critics. Narihira, on the other hand, is criticised for having an excessive conception and insufficient diction, like drooping flowers whose colours have faded but fragrance remains. As an example of this, Tsurayuki cites the following poem, which has an unusually long and detailed headnote. Narihira had been seeing a woman living in the western wing of the palace of the Gojo Empress, and loved her dearly. Shortly after the 10th day of the first month, she disappeared off to somewhere else, and though he found out where she was, he could not communicate with her. When spring came and the plum blossom was in full bloom, on a night when the moon was especially beautiful, he was yearning for the love of the previous year, and went back to the western wing, and, until the moon was low in the sky, lay upon the bare boards. Then he composed the following. Tsuki aranu haru ya mukashi no haru naranu wagami hitotsu wa moto no mi ni shite. Is this not that moon, and spring is as the spring of old, is it not? Only this body of mine is as it ever was. This poem, which was to become one of the single most famous verses in the entire Waka canon, so famous in fact that it was considered poor technique to use it for elusive variation in later years, is highly complex and has been endlessly debated by poets and critics. Is it the same moon as he saw the year before? Well, obviously it is, because the moon is an eternal celestial object, but then, because it waxes and wanes, isn't it being renewed, making it a different moon from the one he saw last year? Spring will always arrive and has the same blossom and weather, but then as each year is new, isn't each spring new and different too? He is the same person, but then again he's not, because he's another year older, and so it's disingenuous to say that he's the same. These complex ideas are to some extent crammed into Narihira's Waka, and it is this feature of intellectual complexity, which is a feature of at least some of his poetry, that Tsurayuki is criticising. Getting back to Kokinshū, as I have just mentioned, in addition to the poems, the anthology also has two prefaces, one written in Japanese and one in Chinese. These are conventionally called the Kana preface, Kanajo, and Mana preface, Manajo, after the names of the scripts which were used to write them, but these names are not part of the manuscripts of the prefaces themselves. As Torquildathi points out, prefaces to poetry anthologies were an established Chinese literary genre in their own right, whose main function was often to make the case that literature played a key role in supporting the state, or that poetry was a universal form of expression, but one which had fallen into decline, or, despite its role as the only acceptable form of literary writing for a scholar official, and one which was capable of expressing the deepest sentiments, it was also capable of deteriorating into mere verbal ornamentation, and thus becoming a vehicle for moral degeneration. The Japanese court adopted the preface as a literary form and used it in the 9th century to introduce the collected anthologies of poetry in Chinese, which were produced then. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that when Kokinshū was produced, it too required a preface to set it in context. Both of the prefaces make their arguments in similar terms, that poetry is a special form of language which is capable of influencing the emotions in mysterious and profound ways, and they discuss principles of poetry which derive ultimately from Chinese poetics and provide examples of poetic sages, as mentioned above. They further tie Waka into the religious underpinnings of the Yamato state by claiming the form's divine origins in a 31-syllable song recited by Susanoo no Mikoto, the storm god and one of the principal deities of the Shinto pantheon. Given that the Imperial House claimed their ultimate ancestor was Amaterasu or Mikami, the sun goddess, this was a way of linking poetry with the imperial state and making a case for its ritual significance as a buttress of the existing political order. Just as in the prefaces' Chinese predecessors, there is also concern expressed about poets' tendency to write work on non-serious subjects, love in particular, and thus the potential for Waka to become a vehicle for moral degeneration. As Torquil also points out, however, it is largely due to Waka's function as a means for informal communication among members of the aristocracy that it existed at all to be considered serious literature. Despite the prominence given to the seasons as a serious topic, placed at the beginning of the anthology, the fact remains that Kokinshu as a whole contains fewer seasonal poems than it does love ones, 342 to 359, and even this number is something of an underestimate because quite a few of the poems which were probably originally written as love poems were redefined as seasonal ones and included in that section too. There is no doubt that of the two prefaces, the Kana preface has long been considered the more significant of the two and has been the object of most scholarly attention. As I've said in another video, it was largely seen as the foundational text of Japanese poetic criticism, and virtually all subsequent writings on poetry in the pre-modern period are based upon it to a greater or lesser degree. Its opening line, Yamato uta wa hito no kokoro o tane toshite yorozu no koto no ha tozo narerikeru. The poetry of Yamato, Waka, has its seed in the human heart and blossoms forth in a myriad leaves of words, may well be the most quoted single line in the entire pre-modern Japanese canon, and you'll be hard-pressed, I think, to find a Japanese individual who would not have come across it at some point in their schooling, even if they don't remember it now. For all that this key canonical statement about the ultimate nature of Waka poetry draws upon prior Chinese analyses of poetics, it nevertheless expresses a key feature of Waka in the 10th century, that it was a literary response to an emotional stimulus. That is, Waka was a way of putting one's feelings into words. One could perhaps say that this is a key feature of all literary writing, but I think it helps to understand the view of what Waka was among the poets who produced it to have this stated explicitly. In my video about Manyoshu, I mentioned that elements of the anthology are strongly influenced by Chinese Six Dynasties poetry. In fact, that influence did not extend only to the 8th century. It also influenced a number of features of 9th century Waka composition, features which were, therefore, influential upon Kokinshu poetry and thus on the later Waka tradition. Just as in the last video, I do not have the time here to provide an extended discussion of Six Dynasties poetry, but Helen McCulloch provides a good overview of this as it relates to Kokinshu in the first chapter of her book, Brocade by Night. Suffice it to say, as McCulloch does, that some topics, themes and rhetorical resources proved much more influential than others, but scarcely any was ignored completely, emphasising that Japanese borrowing was extremely wide-ranging. Konishi Jinichi suggests that this borrowing actually took place during the so-called Dark Age of Waka in the early 9th century, when poetic composition was being dominated by the composition of verse in Chinese, which itself was heavily influenced by Six Dynasties techniques. He suggests that male poets, upon becoming accustomed to the types of elegant and witty expressions which were used in Chinese compositions of this type, they then began to apply them to the Waka which they wrote when communicating with women in romantic situations. These Waka received a positive reception and, in turn, imitation from their female recipients, which led to an even greater adoption of this Chinese-influenced style. Thus, the survival and continuation of Waka as a tradition, and its development into the form it took in the early 10th century, was not only because it was used extensively in romantic situations, but it was also the need to use it in these romantic situations which accelerated borrowing from Chinese. This borrowing was, in fact, not limited to just one facet of Six Dynasties poetry, and included topics, techniques, emotional tone, and approaches. Topics which were developed in the Six Dynasties period included laments, parting, travel, and love. Obviously, the Japanese had been writing love poems long before they had access to Chinese models, but the Chinese verses presented a particular view of love which was strongly associated with the topos of the lonely lady. That is, poets often wrote in the voice of a woman waiting alone for her lover to call, unsuspecting or knowing that he will not. For example, topic unknown. Hanagatami me narabu hito no amata areba wasurarenu ramu kazu naranu mi wa. A flower basket's lattices, and through every gap a lady for comparison. That's how many there are, so it seems he has forgotten me, not one of their number. The anonymous author of this poem begins with the image of a flower-filled basket, which represents the various other women her lover is visiting, something which is made explicit in the subsequent line. The poem then concludes with the sad speculation that the reason for his absence is because he has forgotten her. Here's another example of this trope. Topic unknown. Ai ni aite mono o mou koro no waga sode ni yadoru tsuki sae nururu kao naru. So many times have we met, in gloomy thought upon my sleeves where rests the moon, even her face wet with tears. This is a densely layered and carefully constructed poem. The implication of the initial statement that the lovers have met many times is that the man must now be tired of seeing her, and this is why he has not come to visit on the night in question. These are the gloomy thoughts that are occupying Issei, and she is weeping as she turns them over in her mind. Teardrops fall onto her sleeves where they reflect the moonlight shining into her room, and thus the moon, reflected in her tears, appears to be crying itself. It was not only female poets who adopted this role in their compositions. For example, topic unknown. Hitori no mi nagame furuya no tsuma nareba, hito no shinobu no kusazu o ikeru. All alone, I watched the long rains fall from my roof's ancient edge as memories of her, like the fern's fronds, grow thickly. Here, Noboru is alone and thinking of a woman whom he once loved. This sentence is reinforced by a piece of wordplay in the centre of the poem, in that tsuma means both edge and spouse. The poem is ambiguous as to whether he has been left alone because the woman has died, or because she has grown tired of him and refuses to see him. This was entirely possible, even if a couple were married, because Heian period marital customs bore very little similarity to our own. I don't have time to go into this in detail right now, but suffice it to say that the most common form of aristocratic marriage involved the woman remaining in her parents' house and her husband visiting her with varying degrees of regularity. Thus, in the case of a marital breakdown, it was entirely possible for the woman to simply instruct that the man not be admitted should he come to call. If you want to know more about Heian marital customs, then I recommend William McCulloch's article, Japanese Marriage Institutions in the Heian Period, in the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies, for all that it's almost as old as I am. Getting back to the poem, I hope it's clear that Noboru is adopting the same pose of a lover who has been left alone and is thinking of the person they love, as in the two previous poems by female poets. I say the two previous poems, but as only one of these has a named author, it's possible that the first one is by a male poet who is playing with the trope of the abandoned, lonely lady. In any case, this persona was extensively adopted by both male and female poets in early Waka poetry, and was strongly influential upon conventional ideas about the progression of a love affair. This is linked with a further feature of Six Dynasties poetry, that the emotions people are most likely to express when confronted with the events of their lives are melancholy or gloomy ones. The idea that life is suffering, of course, derives ultimately from Buddhism, but it was strongly expressed as a natural feature of the human condition in Six Dynasties poetry, and this attitude also transmitted itself to Waka. For example, take a look at this poem, which begins Book 12, the second book of love poetry in the anthology. Topic unknown. Omoitsutsu nureba ya hito no mietsuran, yume to shiriseba samezaramashi o. Was I lost in thoughts of love when I closed my eyes? He appeared, and had I known it for a dream, I would not have awakened. Heian folk belief was that if you saw someone in a dream, it meant that they were thinking of you, and thus it was a good indication that your feelings of love for them might well be reciprocated. It seems that this is what the speaker of Komachi's poem has done, but rather than focus on the hopeful thought that this means that her love might not be unrequited, she focuses instead on the frustration she feels that the dream has not gone on longer. This feeling is reinforced in the subsequent poem. Topic unknown. Utatane ni koishiki hito o miteshi yori yumechi wo mono wa tanomi someteki. As I dozed, the man I love appeared, so it is dreams that have begun to comfort me. Here, the speaker's normal condition is misery, and it is only the brief dreams that she has of her lover which bring her any comfort which is only fleeting. This is not to say, of course, that there are no joyful waka, simply that they are in the minority. Also influenced by Buddhist doctrine was the idea that human existence is essentially transient or ephemeral, and this was a key concern for waka poets too. A very common way of conveying this belief was through the image of the cicada shell, utsutsemi, which is the casing left behind by a cicada as it grows. You can see what one looks like here. This usage goes all the way back to Manyoshu, where utsutsemi no, like a cicada shell, functions as a makura kotoba, but it was extensively used in later waka too. The transience of life could be related to humanity, as in, when Fujiwara no Toshiyuki died, Tomonori composed this and sent it to his house. Nete mo miu, nede mo mite keri, o kata wa utsutsemi no yozo, yume ni wa arikeru. In my sleep he appears, even unsleeping do I feel I see him. All is a fleeting world within a dream. I haven't translated utsutsemi literally here because I wanted to give a clearer idea of the expression's function within the poem to readers not familiar with Japanese. But the sentiment that human life is fleeting and transient, something perhaps not surprising in a poem expressing grief at someone's passing, is very clearly expressed here. It's not only human existence, however, which was portrayed as transient. For example, topic unknown. Utsutsemi no yoni mo nitaru ka hanazakura, saku to mishima ni katsu chiri ni keri. This cicada shell world do you resemble, O cherry blossom? The moment that I see you bloom, have you already scattered? Here, it is the cherry blossom, itself a symbol of transience, which is being remarked upon. This poem, however, is an example of another common feature of Kokinshu poetry, the formation of a link between the natural world and the human condition, and the usage of images from the natural world to figuratively refer to that condition. In the poem above, the cicada shell world is the world of human existence, although filtered through the natural image of the cicada shell itself. This is then connected with the transient cherry blossom to create a dual emphasis on the ultimately ephemeral nature of human existence and on the brevity of the cherry blossom. It is techniques such as this which led to the incorporation into poetic diction of a wide range of vocabulary referring to natural phenomena of various kinds, and in turn this has led to at least some of those natural phenomena becoming poetic topics in their own right, in both Six Dynasties poetry and that of the Kokinshū. The preponderant focus on negative emotions led to a prioritization of autumn as the most significant season of the year. Autumn is, after all, that time of year when things are approaching the real death or somnolence of winter, and is thus the most appropriate season to use as a figurative representation of a person's approaching death. Autumn imagery, which was developed in Six Dynasties poetry and absorbed into Waka, included, among others, cicadas, the moon, migrating geese, scattering leaves, long nights, the chill wind, frost, fireflies, monkey cries, chrysanthemums, and more. If autumn was the most significant season, then logically its opposite, spring, was the second most important, and Waka poetry borrowed extensively from Six Dynasties spring topics, including warblers, plum blossoms and other flowers, gentle breezes, new willow growth, and lingering snow. Similar borrowing took place for summer and winter, with snow cover, frost, ice and cold being adopted for the latter season, and heat and cooling rain with the former. Finally, in many of these poems, poets adopted a pose of what might be termed elegant confusion, making their poems frequently question whether they could trust the evidence of their eyes. A typical example of this will be the innumerable poems written wondering whether what the poet beheld on the branches of a plum tree was lingering snow or white plum blossom. For example, composed on the snow resting on the trees. Haru tateba hana toya miraramu, shirayuki no kakareru eda ni uguisuzo naku. Spring is swelling, is that blossom I see, white snow hanging on the branches where the warbler sings. As the topic of the poem makes clear, what the poet is seeing on the branches is in fact snow, but he speculates that it might be blossom, and then extends this pose of confusion to the bush warbler itself, wondering whether the bird will be confused by the snow hanging on the branches, think it blossom, and so come and start to sing earlier than it would normally do. This confusion was, of course, entirely feigned, and can give some poems a somewhat knowing air, like this one perhaps. This too was a poetic technique adopted from Six Dynasties poetry. Due to its prevalence, we can safely say that it was extremely influential upon early Waka, but it did lead to some criticism of Kokinshu work as being overly arch and focused on utilising intricate expressions and techniques at the expense of conveying honest feelings. So, to sum up the key features of Kokinshu poetry are, following Konishi Junichi in his article, The Genesis of the Kokinshu Style. 1. The conceptual approach is intellectual. 2. The boundary lines between the natural world and human experience are blurred. 3. Whether the subject is nature or man, there is a strong tendency to treat it in terms of the passage of time. And 4. The tone is subdued, elegant and graceful. I hope that you can recognise a number of these features in the example poems I have already provided. But what does it mean that the conceptual approach is intellectual? This means that Kokinshu poems tend to express a form of reasoned inquiry about a natural phenomenon. We can clearly see this in the very first poem in the anthology by Ariwara no Motokata. Composed on a day when spring arrived in the old year. Toshi no uchi haru wa ki ni keri, hito to se o kozo to yaiwan, kotoshi to yaiwan. Within the year, spring has come again. The 1 year, what should I say? That it's last year? Or that it's the year to come? This poem describes a not unusual situation in Heian, Japan, when a mismatch occurred between the calendrical and meteorological years, and thus the season of spring has already begun when it's still the 12th month of the year. Motokata approaches this situation intellectually, expressing to his audience that he is in the process of reasoning out how he should describe and discuss the situation. By placing a poem of this type as the very first one in the anthology, the compilers are making a statement about what they consider good poetry to be. Konishi provides extensive examples of this type of somewhat intellectual approach to poetic composition in his article, so I strongly suggest reading it for more details than I can provide here. The final feature of Kokinshu's organisation which I wish to mention here is that of association and progression between the poems in the anthology. There is no doubt that the compilers both chose the works they included carefully and organised them in such a way as to provide sequences of images and approaches to different topics as you progress through the collection as a whole. Lewis Cook suggests that being able to provide this sense of progression and association was a more important criterion for deciding upon whether a poem was included or not than individual poems' quality. That is, According to some analyses, Kokinshū was never intended to be a collection of entirely exemplary poems, the very best and only the very best. Instead, it was composed of interlocking sequences of poems with related associations and topics, which gradually come together over the course of the entire anthology to produce one overarching work, and it was thus essential that the poems which were chosen for inclusion fitted into this overall sequence, which necessitated the exclusion of some good work. We know this to be the case because quite a number of exemplary poems which would have been available to the compilers for inclusion were not chosen for Kokinshū, but made their way into latter Imperial anthologies. It's difficult to demonstrate how these principles of progression work in practice without showing a significant number of poems in sequence, which is not really feasible to do in this presentation. With that being said, however, we did see a very small example of association and progression with the two poems by Komachi I provided earlier, which follow each other in the anthology and contain similar but slightly variant takes on the theme of viewing one's lover in one's dreams. For a detailed discussion of the sequencing of poems in Kokinshū with examples, I suggest you read Chapter 7, The Kokinshū as Literary Entity, of Helen McCulloch's detailed study of the anthology Brocade by Night. I think I'm going to bring my presentation to an end there, because I'm sure I've given you plenty of food for thought about Japan's first Imperial anthology and the poetry contained within it. Now is the time to take a break, think over what I've said, and then maybe have a read of some of the work's contents. There are two complete English translations, one by Helen McCulloch and one by Laurel Rodd, and selections from it are included in most anthologies of classical Japanese poetry. There are also 679 Kokinshu Waka, including all the seasonal poems, available on my website online. Enjoy.